Some secrets of Egypt were not erased by time. They were erased on purpose. And among all the mysteries that the sand has tried to bury, there is one so delicate, so dangerous, and so deeply linked to power that no scribe dared to record even a single line about it. Today, you will learn about the silent pact that shaped successions, destroyed lives, and involved the Pharaoh's own daughters in a plot that should never have survived. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories that time has tried to hide, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel bring more forbidden narratives like this one. Now come back with me inside the palace. The light that filters through the cracks in the walls is not ordinary. It enters filtered, carrying the golden dust of the desert, as if each particle carried a fragment of ancient memory. The air smells of lotus and burnt oil, a soft, ritualistic aroma that mixes with the muffled echo of disciplined footsteps. Nothing there moves without intention. Nothing speaks without permission. Nothing breathes too loudly within the corridors where the dynasty guards its darkest secrets. Ahead of you, two servants walk with their heads bowed. The long fabrics they drag across the floor seem like silent waves of an invisible Nile, flowing with absolute obedience. They do not look at each other. They do not adjust their pace. They show no emotion. They have been trained to serve the most untouchable women in Egypt, the Pharaoh's daughters. And it is in this contrast, the luxury that everyone sees and the fear that no one comments on, that you begin to understand the truth. The royal daughters do not live surrounded only by perfumes and jewels. They live within a system that molds, watches, and uses them from the first day of their lives. To the people, they seem like divine figures. To the palace, they are pieces, silent pieces in a game where power always wins and where their will is never consulted. The young woman walking ahead of the servants has her face hidden by a thin veil, but her body does not hide the tension. Her shoulders are too erect, her hands clasped with exaggerated force, her breathing is short. She knows where she is being taken. Not because someone has explained it to her, but because every Pharaoh's daughter grows up with the feeling that one day she would be called. Called to something she does not understand. Called to something she cannot refuse. When she arrives before the semicircular stone door, two older women are already waiting for her. They are silent guardians of traditions that have never been written down. They bear discreet tattoos of lotuses and falcons on their wrists, marks that do not represent faith, but absolute commitment to what happens inside. They ask nothing, they give no instructions. They only observe the young woman with a trained, firm, almost cold gaze, as if they were evaluating not who she is, but what she is about to become. The door, heavy and covered with worn hieroglyphs, carries a strange unease. The more you look at it, the more you notice details that do not match the rest of the palace. A falcon with open wings dominates the upper part of the entrance, but below it, there are three female figures with shaved faces. Not by time, by intention. Almost as if someone centuries ago had decided that those women should not be remembered. When the guardians push the door open, the sound is not thunderous. It is muffled, as if the stone were reluctant to reveal what it holds. Inside, the dimness is dense. The air is colder, heavier, almost still. You have the feeling that that space does not belong to the palace, it belongs to the secret. The young woman enters and the veil falls, revealing a face that tries to appear serene, but carries the fear of someone who has learned from an early age that her life does not belong to her. Inside the room, there is a stone table with three objects: an extinguished lamp, a bracelet broken in half, and a small roll of papyrus without words. Only scratches and torn marks, as if someone had tried to write something forbidden and then erased it in a hurry. The guardians close the door behind her, and the sound resonates like a sentence. No one else will enter. No one else will know. No one else will write about what will happen there. And as silence takes over the room, you understand what the scribes feared to record. The Pharaoh's daughters were not just royal women, they were the invisible pillars that supported the throne. And in that forbidden room, began the pact that destroyed their identities in the name of the dynasty. Egypt left traces of its wars, its kings, its temples. But what happened between those walls? That it tried to eliminate completely. But to understand the pact that involved these young women, first you need to see the palace as it really was. Not a divine symbol, but a golden prison built to control every movement of the Pharaoh's daughters. The Pharaoh's palace, seen from the outside, looks like a construction made to impress gods. Its towering columns, its painted facades, its gardens irrigated by the Nile, everything conveys the idea of perfection, stability, and absolute power. But when you walk through the internal corridors, you discover that there is a huge distance between the public image of the palace and what really happens behind the walls where the dynasty breathes. Beauty is just a facade, order just a surface. What lies beneath is a system that transforms even the most privileged of lives into a carefully watched piece. The Pharaoh's daughters are educated from an early age to understand this duality. To the people, they are divine symbols, living manifestations of the gods' protection over Egypt. To the palace, however, they are tools, silent instruments used to secure alliances, stabilize internal disputes, reinforce the legitimacy of the throne, and, when necessary, neutralize threats that could never be faced in any other way. Their blood carries a responsibility that does not ask for authorization and does not offer mercy. Inside the women's quarters, the routine is controlled with military precision. Every gesture is observed, every word is measured. Every exit is authorized or denied based on interests that the young women themselves rarely understand. The royal harem, which many imagine as a place of luxuries and privileges, is in fact a rigid system of surveillance in which servants, guards, and even the women closest to the pharaoh follow codes too old to be questioned. There, trust does not exist, only hierarchy exists. The official wives live on one level, the concubines on another, the pharaoh's daughters on a third, and above all are those whose role is never spoken aloud. Some daughters belong neither to the wives nor to the concubines. They are designated from a young age for spiritual and political functions that not even the court fully understands. They grow up hearing phrases like, "You carry the light of the throne," or "Your silence preserves the kingdom." And little by little, they learn that these words, however poetic they may seem, actually mean renunciation. Emotional control is an essential part of this training. Crying is not allowed, questioning is not allowed, expressing fear is seen as a failure. Many are taught to smile at ceremonies while their minds are molded to obey without ever showing weakness. The worst thing a royal daughter can do is reveal what she feels, because feeling inside the palace is considered a threat, and threats need to be neutralized. The scribes, despite recording almost everything, do not have access to these spaces. The inner chambers of the pharaoh's daughters are zones of absolute silence. No papyrus describes their routine. No record details the nights they spent in forbidden rooms, nor the instructions they received, nor the pacts they were forced to accept. Everything that involves these young women is omitted, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too essential to be documented. The absence of records is, in itself, a message. There are things that should not be written, and behind all this structure, there is an even more disturbing truth. The palace does not fear invaders, storms, or plagues. What the palace fears are the daughters themselves. It fears what they know. It fears what they witness. It fears that one of them, one day, will decide to break the silence, because the daughters are the only ones who see what no foreigner, no priest, and no scribe could see. They carry, without choice, the secrets that keep dynasties alive and that could destroy them if they were revealed. When you realize this, the image of the palace changes completely. It stops looking like a glorious monument and becomes a golden prison, a prison so refined, so polished, so carefully built, that even its victims believe they were born to be there. And it is in this scenario, between decorated walls and doors that hide more than they show, that the dark secret of the Pharaoh's daughters began to be woven. A secret that does not appear on papyri, a secret that no scribe dared to write. A secret that shaped the history of Egypt in silence, and that is still strong enough to cause discomfort thousands of years later. But no pact is born without a reason. To understand how this secret arose, we need to go back to the day when an unexpected death plunged Egypt into silence and opened space for an agreement that should never have existed. The story of the secret did not begin with a ceremony, nor with a sacred vision, nor with a formal decree engraved in stone. It began with a death, unexpected, silent, and politically devastating. When the Pharaoh of that period died before his time, without warning, without a ready successor, and without stability in the kingdom, Egypt plunged into a dangerous vacuum. Palaces that once seemed solid trembled inside. Powerful families disputed influence with the speed of hungry jackals. Priests of Ammon whispered contradictory advice. And the people, unaware that the chaos was starting at the top, only continued to raise their prayers at dawn. That morning, when the Pharaoh's body was still being prepared by the embalmers, the palace corridors echoed with hurried footsteps. What was at stake was not only the succession to the throne, but the very legitimacy of the royal lineage, which could be challenged if any faction presented a candidate strong enough to proclaim himself heir. The internal disputes were not recorded by the scribes, by direct order of the priests, because admitting the fragility of the monarchy was admitting that the divine will could be shaken. It was in this climate of tension that a small group was called to a secret meeting in one of the innermost rooms of the palace. Priests, advisors, and two women of high family standing, both responsible for the education of the royal daughters, were gathered before an alabaster table marked with ancient symbols. There, away from the ears and eyes of scribes, a decision would be made. A decision that would change the destinies of women who were not even old enough to understand the weight of their own names. The priests claimed that the gods had given a sign, but no one in that room really believed it. What they had was political calculation. And the calculation was simple. The lineage needed to be protected, and at that moment, only the Pharaoh's daughters had enough symbolic power to prevent other men, thirsty for influence, from trying to take the throne. Their presence, silent, ritualistic, mandatory, would be the visual seal that the divine inheritance still flowed through the royal house. But there was a problem. For this strategy to work, the daughters needed to participate in a ceremony that did not exist until then. A ceremony that would unite, in an indisputable way, the royal blood to the new successor. A ceremony that would require total submission, absolute loyalty, and a vow of silence so deep that it would survive even death. It was necessary to create a ritual that left no room for interpretations, that could not be contested by rival factions, that did not allow any loophole to be used against the chosen heir. And it was there, at that table, at that moment, that the pact was born. Not a pact with the gods, but a pact between powerful men, and those who would pay the price would be the daughters. The ritual would be secret, their participation mandatory. The scribes forbidden to record any word. The servants sworn to never speak. The consequences irreversible. The main objective was to consolidate the succession before the invisible cameras of the palace, the watchful eyes of the generals, the priests, the influential families. A royal daughter positioned next to the new pharaoh meant continuity. 2 daughters meant divine strength. 3 daughters meant absolute imposition. It was a carefully constructed theater to appear spiritual, but which, in reality, hid the political urgency of a dynasty at risk. The ritual, of course, would need symbols, objects, gestures, marks that only those involved would understand. Not because they were mystical, but because symbols are powerful. Silence is too. And over time, what was born as strategic improvisation began to take on the appearance of tradition, as if it had always existed, as if it were part of the very nature of the Pharaoh's daughters. From that day on, the lives of these young women ceased to belong only to them. Each one would carry not only her own stories, but the weight of a pact that should never have existed. A pact born from the death of a king, and that would survive all who dared to challenge it. And as the years passed, when new pharaohs ascended the throne, when the daughters grew old in silence, the ritual continued to exist, not because it was true, but because it was useful. And what is useful for power rarely disappears. It only hides. And for centuries this pact remained hidden, not by forgetfulness, but by fear. Fear of what would happen if someone someday dared to describe it. Before being taken to the Forbidden Room, these young women went through years of silent preparation, an invisible training that shaped thoughts, emotions, and even the way they should exist within the palace. The Pharaoh's daughters grew up in rooms that seemed made for enchantment. Blue fabrics filtered the morning light, alabaster vases exhaled the constant scent of lotus, musicians tuned harps in the distance, and servants walked like silent shadows between columns painted with scenes of gods and ancient battles. But any attentive observer would quickly realize that the enchantment was only on the surface. All that careful beauty functioned as a trap, a golden frame built to trap young spirits within an implacable discipline. From a very early age, each daughter was trained not to live, but to represent. Represent purity, represent order, represent continuity, represent the light of the royal house, as the priests like to say. Their first lessons were not of games or childish fantasies. They were of posture, silence, and emotional control. They learned to sit without moving their torso, to walk without making noise, to keep their gaze serene, even when fear tightened their throats. The palace did not tolerate hesitations, and if a girl trembled, smiled too much, or asked inconvenient questions, the older servants would approach slowly, place their hands on her shoulders, and teach firmly that the Pharaoh's daughters cannot be seen faltering. Intellectual education also came, but always filtered. The girls learned to read and write in hieroglyphs, to play delicate instruments, to memorize myths and genealogies. However, they did not have access to the papyri that described politics, war, or economics, subjects considered inappropriate, not because they were complex, but because, according to the court, the female mind should not carry burdens that belonged to men. Still, everyone knew that their presence was essential precisely in these political moments. The palace denied knowledge to the daughters, but demanded from them consequences of that same knowledge. There was also an invisible division between the young women. Some were raised to be wives of generals, others to be public symbols in sacred ceremonies. Others were chosen from an early age for roles that no one dared to name, as if even whispers could awaken unwanted forces. These last ones lived in inner chambers, accompanied by servants dedicated exclusively to them, servants who spent years without setting foot outside the palace. The lives of these girls were marked by nocturnal walks, silent instructions, rituals of observation, and long hours of isolation, as if they were being molded to carry something that no other person should see. The psychological training was even more implacable. A pharaoh's daughter should never show pain. She should never show sadness. She should never show desire. Her emotions belonged to the palace, and the palace decided when they could be displayed and to whom. If they cried at night, no human ear should hear. If they felt fear, they should swallow it until it turned into discipline. If they questioned, they were punished not with violence, but with silence. And silence in that environment hurt more than any blow. Servants told ancient stories in whispers, stories of daughters who refused to obey, of princesses who tried to escape, of young women who challenged the role that was imposed on them. In these stories, none of them had a happy ending. Some were sent to distant temples, others disappeared inside rooms that were now locked forever, and others were removed from official records as if they had never existed. This was the unspoken warning. The palace does not tolerate rebellious daughters. And, at the same time, the girls were surrounded by beauty rituals, aromatic baths, and delicate ornaments. Not out of care, but out of strategy. A pharaoh's daughter needed to look divine. She needed to look untouchable. She needed to carry in her gaze that serenity that the people confused with the blessing of the gods, when, in reality, it was just the result of years of rigid emotional training, molded to hide the truth that sustained the dynasty. Their lives were not public, but they were observed. They were not free, but they were required. They were not cruel on the surface, but they were devastating in the invisible. And when one of these daughters grew up enough, when her gaze already carried more silence than childhood, when her posture no longer betrayed fear, when she learned to smile without showing feeling, she was taken to the same forbidden room that you saw in the opening, the silent environment where began the part of life that would never be recorded. Because everything that mattered most in the lives of the pharaoh's daughters was not in the papyri. It was in what the palace made a point of hiding. And it was, at this moment in their lives, at the crossroads between duty, fear, and silence, that began the path to the dark secret that would sustain the dynasty for generations. And it is only after understanding this training that you realize the real role of the pharaoh's daughters. For they were not just decorative figures, but central pieces in the political machine that decided who would ascend the throne. In the common imagination, the succession of a pharaoh seems simple. The throne passes to the strongest, most prepared, most beloved by the gods, male heir. But within the internal corridors of the palace, those where the light enters halfway and where the doors close without producing an echo, everyone knows that nothing is as straightforward as the official stories suggest. The passage of power in Egypt always required something deeper, more symbolic, more delicate than the public records admit. And it is at this point that the importance of the pharaoh's daughters is revealed. They were what no one dared to name, the living seal of legitimacy. The last argument, the last resort, the last gesture capable of proving to the court, the people, and the priests that the lineage remained intact, even when power faltered. From childhood, the daughters were trained not only to obey, but to be seen, or more precisely, to be seen at the right time, in the right place, before the right people. A serene gaze, an impeccable posture. The simple act of remaining silent next to the new pharaoh could keep generals aligned, calm dissatisfied nobles, and silence rumors that would threaten the stability of the kingdom. They were raised to be presence, a presence that alone sustained the belief that the reign continued under the protection of the gods. There were public traditions, appearances at festivals, parades before the population, offerings to the Nile at the time of floods. But there were also private rituals, those that happened without witnesses, without scribes, without chants. Rituals in which the young royal daughter needed to be next to the chosen heir, positioned at a calculated distance, wearing specific adornments, making gestures that carried meanings that only the elites understood. It was in these moments that the future of Egypt was decided. Not in the great halls, not in the monumental temples, but in small chambers, illuminated by burnt oil, where politics disguised itself as devotion. Some of these rituals had clear purposes: to present the eldest daughter to the heir, to consolidate the symbolic union between the two halves of the dynasty. Others were more opaque, more ambiguous, and involved silent oaths in which the young women promised to maintain the lineage and serve as living witnesses of the purity of the royal blood. A broken oath did not only mean disobedience, it meant an existential threat to the throne. And there were still even more subtle, almost imperceptible moments in which the pharaoh's daughter served as a watershed between rivals. Her mere appearance next to a prince was enough to seal the fate of another. Her measured smile was enough to indicate which faction the court should follow. Her silence before a general was enough to demonstrate that his presence was not desired. No word was said, but every gesture was interpreted, recorded, and used politically. The priests knew this, and used this power. The generals knew this, and feared this power. The royal wives knew this, and often tried to influence the daughter in their favor. But the only one who had no choice, no voice, no alternative path was the young woman herself. Their role in the succession also brought a heavy shadow: the responsibility to protect the throne against internal disputes. In turbulent periods, when there was more than one potential heir, the daughters were instructed to participate in private ceremonies with the one the court wished to favor. Her presence next to him on the first nights of preparation for the coronation was seen as a sign of divine approval, even if the people never knew it. It was a theater made only for internal eyes, a theater that decided wars before they began. And when one of these young women hesitated, when she showed fear, when she could not hide her aversion to what was demanded of her, the palace interpreted the hesitation as weakness. And weakness within the royal house was not tolerated. A pharaoh's daughter who refused her function could be immediately replaced by another sister. In more serious cases, she was isolated, punished, and eventually removed from official records. The daughter who broke the pact ceased to exist, not because she died, but because she was erased. This was their secret role: to protect the throne with their own presence, with their own absence, with their own silence. They were not queens. They were not protagonists. They were invisible columns on which the entire structure rested. And the more you observe this system, the more you realize the true horror. The dynasty did not survive despite the daughters. It survived because of them. And ironically, none of them could tell the world the price they paid to keep alive a lineage that never really belonged to them. And then, when the whole court believed that nothing would surprise them anymore, came the moment that defined their lives. The silent ritual inside the forbidden room, the ceremony that no scribe was allowed to record. There was a part of the lives of the Pharaoh's daughters that did not appear in the paintings on the walls, nor in the chants of the priests, nor in the public ceremonies that enchanted the people of Egypt. It was a part so carefully hidden that even the oldest servants avoided pronouncing words that could bring their mouths closer to this subject. It was not a written rite. It was not a formalized ceremony. It was not something that could be explained with rules. It was a pact of silence, of loyalty, and of renunciation, so deep that it survived for generations without appearing in a single papyrus. The secret always began in the same way, with a door that closed behind them. While the corridors continued to be lit by lamps and perfumes, the interior of that forbidden room plunged into a dense penumbra, broken only by small sparks of oil in ceramic bowls. The daughters never entered there of their own free will. They were led, guided, shaped from childhood to believe that this moment represented the highest duty of a daughter of the royal house. But when the door closed, the title disappeared. What remained was only stillness. The forbidden room was not large. It was narrow, oval, with walls covered in inscriptions so old that some symbols had lost their original meaning. The figures represented women offering objects to gods and pharaohs, but the faces had been deliberately erased, as if the past wanted to hide not only what happened there, but who was inside. And the more you looked at those walls, the more you realized that the erasures were all done in the same place, on the faces of the women, as if identity was the first sacrifice demanded by the ritual. In the center of the room was a circle marked with dark pigment, not red as in Babylon, but a deep tone that resembled resin heated in the sun. Around it were three objects: a bracelet broken in half, an extinguished lamp, and a strip of linen that carried a braided symbol, perhaps a ritual knot, perhaps just a property mark. These objects were arranged in the same way in all ceremonies, as if they represented something that the daughters should understand without anyone needing to explain. The young women stood inside the circle, and there began the silent oath that sustained entire dynasties. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They kept their hands joined over their wombs, breathing deeply as they waited. Outside, servants and priestesses guarded the door like living statues, ensuring that no sound escaped and no external ear came too close. And then the heir entered. Not in pomp, not in glory, not as a future pharaoh adorned with gold, but as a man who needed to be legitimized. His presence inside that room had a single objective: to seal the pact that the scribes would never describe. Instead of words, there were gestures, carefully rehearsed, deeply symbolic, impossible to interpret without knowing the silent code created by the first priests who idealized the ritual. He touched the broken bracelet, she touched the extinguished lamp, and together they placed their hands on the strip of linen. Nothing more, nothing less. But for the palace, that was enough. The intention of the ritual was not mystical. It was political. By sharing that moment with the pharaoh's daughter, the heir received from her, and only from her, what the court interpreted as divine approval of the lineage. He tied his name to the blood of the dead pharaoh. He prevented rival factions from claiming illegitimacy. He sealed the continuity of the throne without the need to shed blood in the main hall. But for the young woman, the ritual had another meaning, a silent weight that would accompany her for the rest of her life. The broken bracelet symbolized the break with her childhood. The extinguished lamp represented the end of her individual identity. And the braided linen, which united her hands with those of the heir, symbolized the absolute surrender of what she had never chosen to give: her voice, her presence, her obedience. After the ritual, no word was allowed. No look could be exchanged between those involved. No gesture could denounce what happened there. The servants took the young woman back to her chambers, where she would spend the night in silence, under surveillance. The heir was led to the opposite side of the palace, to be presented to the priests as the chosen one, and the next day the entire court would pretend that nothing had happened, because for Egypt the gods legitimized the new pharaoh. But for those who knew the secret, it was the silent presence of the daughter, alone, inside a forbidden room, that had sustained the dynasty. The most disturbing thing is that even centuries later, no one knows exactly what happened in that room, beyond these gestures. Some fragments of papyrus mention the weight of the lineage. Others speak of nights that should not be remembered. Still others suggest that there were different versions of the pact depending on the political crisis. But everyone agrees on one thing: the scribes never recorded this ritual because they were forbidden to do so. And what is not written does not officially exist. And what does not officially exist cannot be questioned. The secret survived because it lived only in silence. And silence in Egypt was more powerful than any word engraved in stone. But the real horror was not in the pact. It was in what happened when a daughter failed, because breaking this silence did not mean disobedience. It meant disappearance. The walls of the palace were built to withstand the desert wind, the Nile floods, and even the attacks of foreign enemies. But they were not made to withstand fear, and few things aroused as much fear among the servants, concubines, and priests as the rumor that a pharaoh's daughter had failed in the pact, that silent pact that united the heir to the royal lineage and that sustained the invisible order of Egypt. When a daughter hesitated inside the forbidden room, when her gesture trembled, when her breath failed, when her gaze wandered, when her heart revealed the humanity that the palace was trying to erase, something changed in the air. The heir noticed. The oldest priestess noticed. Even the walls seemed to notice, as if they held their own memory. And that small failure, which could be seen as common fragility in any other woman, became, within that environment, a threat to the stability of the dynasty. The punishment was never announced. It happened in the same way that the secret was born, in absolute silence. The morning after the ritual, while the court prepared to greet the future pharaoh, the young woman was discreetly removed from her chambers. She could not take adornments, she could not wear the embroidered robes she used to wear, she could not say goodbye to sisters or servants. Accompanied by two older women, always the same, always expressionless, she was led through corridors that rarely received human footsteps. Cold, narrow corridors, where the sun never fully entered and where even the sound of a breath seemed out of place. The oldest servants called this path the corridor of no return, not because it led to death, but because it led to oblivion. The young woman was led to a small side door, often mistaken for storage rooms or storage rooms. Behind it, however, were chambers intended for women who failed in the pact. They were not prisons, they were not temples, they were not cells. They were spaces of erasure, places where identities slowly disappeared, like ink diluted in water. The punishment began with isolation. She remained there for days, sometimes weeks, attended only by a servant who did not exchange words with her. Water was served in simple bowls. The food, silent. No decorations on the walls, no sign that life continued outside. It was an environment built not to punish the body, but to dissolve the presence, to weaken what the palace feared most, memory. Then came the official erasure. The scribes received direct orders, always accompanied by priests, to remove the young woman's name from the internal records. Entire lines of lists were crossed out forcefully, sometimes to the point of marking the papyrus to the layer below. It was as if the very act of writing about her was offensive, dangerous, forbidden. In inscriptions that mentioned the royal daughters during festivals, she simply ceased to exist. In genealogies, she was replaced by gaps. In counts of descendants, her number was ignored. Egypt was a master at preserving the past, but it was also a master at erasing what it could not admit. The servant responsible for caring for this punished daughter had the duty to watch over her until the palace decided her fate. In some cases, the young woman was sent to distant temples where she would spend the rest of her life in silence, dedicated to minor tasks that did not resemble her original position. In others, she was welcomed by distant relatives who received payment to keep the secret. And there were still darker cases, those in which the young woman simply disappeared among the gears of the palace, swallowed by a system that knew how to hide shadows. The most tragic thing is that for the sisters and for the closest servants, no explanation was given. They only realized that one of the young women had disappeared, that her name was no longer mentioned, that her existence had been swallowed by silence. And everyone knew that asking about her would be too dangerous. In Egypt, certain questions were considered crimes not for challenging the gods, but for challenging power. The punishment did not end with the young woman's disappearance. It continued in the whispers, in the stories that servants told to younger girls as a warning, in the repressed fears that arose whenever the ritual approached. Every daughter grew up knowing that there were two ways to leave the palace, as a symbol of power or as an erased shadow. And as you observe this system, you realize that the horror is not only in what happened to those who failed. The horror is in the fact that the punishment was created to be invisible, silent, impossible to prove, impossible to write. The horror is in the idea that the palace, so glorious in the eyes of Egypt, survived for centuries, sustained not only by the strength of the pharaohs, but by the silence of the daughters, and by the cruel fate of those who dared to break the pact. And no secret, however powerful, survives when a dynasty begins to crumble. When Egypt changed hands, the pact was swept away, along with everything that threatened the new power. No dynasty of Egypt believed that one day it would be forgotten. Each pharaoh built temples, obelisks, stone colossi, believing that memory would be as eternal as the banks of the Nile. The paintings on the walls were made not only to record, but to defy time. Each repeated symbol, each engraved cartouche, each drawn offering had one objective: to prevent oblivion from winning. But oblivion is patient, and when the dynasty that created the Daughters' Pact began to crumble, it finally found the first cracks. The fall was not immediate. It was not marked by violence or fires, but by something much more dangerous: internal distrust. Generals who had previously sworn allegiance began to question the legitimacy of the heir. Priests rivaled factions that wanted to take greater control of the court. The borders weakened, the economy swayed, and the people, restless, began to look at the palace with less reverence and more doubt. It was in this unstable climate that the Daughters' Pact became too dangerous. Not because of what happened inside the Forbidden Room, but because of what it represented: a silent power that was not in the hands of the men who ruled. The court decided that in order to stabilize the dynasty, it would be necessary to eliminate any trace of practices that could not be explained publicly. And destroying evidence of the Daughters' Pact became a priority, not for morality, but for political convenience. The erasure began in the papyri. Scribes, men trained to preserve history, received explicit orders to scrape off female names, omit participation in internal ceremonies, erase fragments of genealogies. Some protested, saying that history should not be manipulated, but priests replied that history does not exist without those who write it. And with that, entire pages disappeared. Lines were removed so carefully that it seemed they had never existed. In the corridors of the palace, objects associated with the daughters, ceremonial bracelets, strips of ritual linen, extinguished lamps, were collected and hidden inside chambers where they would be buried with other unwanted artifacts. It was as if the court itself was trying to bury an uncomfortable past before it became a weapon in the hands of opponents. And the young women involved in the pact? They became victims of an even more cruel process: social erasure. The older daughters were sent to distant temples with new names, new routines, new servants. Those who had participated in internal ceremonies were relocated to isolated areas of the palace, where they would live without official functions and without contact with the rest of the court. Some, according to fragmented accounts, were given to influential families as protectors, although everyone knew that the real objective was to keep them away from the corridors where political decisions were made. Over time, the dynasty that created the pact weakened irreversibly. A new pharaoh took over, a new council was formed, new traditions were imposed, and everything that had been built with silence and fear was erased with the same coldness with which it had been born. The new rulers ordered the destruction of inscriptions that mentioned certain daughters of the old pharaoh. In some temples, modern archaeologists found evidence that female figures were scraped from murals so carefully that only the outline of the garments remained. In other chambers, names were replaced by generic symbols, as if someone had deliberately erased any trace of individuality. It was as if Egypt, so proud of recording everything, had decided that some lives were too dangerous to remain in memory. The fall of the dynasty also brought another effect: the disappearance of the Forbidden Room. Doors were sealed, objects were burned, servants sworn to silence disappeared without record, and the space that once sustained the pact became just another dark room inside a palace full of shadows. When archaeologists tried to identify which room could have been used for the ceremonies, they found only empty walls and marks of recent removal, as if someone, centuries ago, had tried to erase the last vestiges of a story that should not survive. And, observing all this, you realize that the true power of the secret was not in the rituals. It was in the fear that surrounded its existence. It was in the silence that it imposed. It was in the fact that powerful men preferred to destroy part of their own history than to let the world know how the throne really was sustained. Because in the end, Egypt did not erase the Daughters' Pact because it was shameful. It erased it because it was dangerous. Too dangerous to be remembered, too dangerous to be questioned, too dangerous to survive the fall of a dynasty. Centuries later, when everything seemed lost, it was the hidden fragments, scraped names, burned papyri, and erased inscriptions that revealed that the silence had not been complete. For a long time, it was believed that the secret of the Pharaoh's daughters had been completely erased, and in a way it was. Ancient Egypt was a master at destroying what it could not control, and the silent pact that united the daughters to the throne seemed to have disappeared without leaving witnesses, without leaving documents, without even leaving rumors among later dynasties. But history, even when they try to silence it, finds ways to survive in the most unlikely places, in broken fragments, in excessively deep scrapings, in suspicious gaps where there should be names. The first clues emerged at the end of the 19th century, when archaeologists were excavating a secondary wing of a palace in the Thebes region. They were looking for common artifacts, amulets, ceramics, everyday objects, nothing that suggested dynastic secrets. But when they removed deeper layers of debris, they found a set of charred papyri, carefully rolled up, as if someone had tried to protect them moments before abandoning them forever. The material was so fragile that it seemed to disintegrate at the touch. Still, some lines were preserved. One of the papyri mentioned something disconcerting. "Those who carry the weight of the lineage must not be named." The phrase was short, incomplete, but clear enough to generate debates that last to this day. Experts disagree on who these women would be. Some theories point to priestesses, others to royal concubines. But the combination of the words lineage and must not be named raised immediate suspicions about Pharaoh's daughters involved in practices that should never be recorded. Years later, another type of evidence emerged. Not papyri, but absences. In genealogies carved on the walls of temples and tombs, there are gaps where female names should be. In some cases, you only see an empty cartouche. In others, the name was scraped with such careful precision that only a slight sinking remains in the stone, invisible to the naked eye, but revealed by modern oblique lighting techniques. These scrapings are not accidental or the result of time. They were produced intentionally by trained hands, obeying direct orders. In 1932, a team working in a secondary tomb in the Valley of the Nobles found something even more curious. An inscription that mentioned 3 daughters of a pharaoh. But the name of the third was entirely removed, while above the scraping there was an almost imperceptible annotation made by a scribe, "Do not record." It is rare, almost unprecedented, to find direct instructions of this type. Its existence indicates that certain events involving these young women were, in fact, forbidden to be written. Another significant discovery came in the early 2000s, when a French archaeologist was examining wall fragments found behind an old warehouse in Luxor. 2 blocks of stone presented ritual scenes, women offering objects to a male figure with the posture of an heir. But something was wrong. The faces of the women had been erased so carefully that the trace of the tool looked like a scar, and the objects they held were strangely familiar: a broken bracelet, an extinguished lamp, a piece of braided linen. The coincidence with the elements that appear in the fragments of papyri raised the suspicion that these objects were symbols used only in internal ceremonies. Ceremonies so sensitive that the court preferred to destroy their traces when the dynasty came to an end. Archaeologists also observed that the scene portrayed was not public. There were no offerings to gods, there were no priests, there were no chants. It was intimate, silent, restricted, and its subsequent erasure suggests that it involved something that official history could not admit. Field reports also reveal another pattern. In several archaeological sites linked to that dynasty, small strips of linen with braided symbols were found, almost always kept in unlikely places, behind walls, inside sealed chambers, under stone floors. They never appear in conventional religious contexts. They are always associated with female spaces inside the palace. For some modern scholars, this indicates that these strips were part of the ritual that united the daughters to the heir, a symbol of submission and loyalty that after the fall of the dynasty was destroyed or hidden deliberately. There are also letters from 20th century archaeologists that mention female chambers where nothing was recorded. These spaces, small, without decoration, with worn floors only in the center, match late descriptions of rooms used for internal court rituals. The most intriguing thing is that none of these chambers appear on the official plans of the palaces. It's as if they never existed, and yet they are there, silent, omitted, carrying marks of use that do not match common functions. When all these fragments are placed side by side, the scrapings, the incomplete papyri, the genealogical gaps, the erased scenes, the hidden chambers, an image emerges that cannot be ignored. Someone tried to erase the history of these women with extreme zeal. And ironically, it was this zeal that allowed small traces to survive. Egypt did not leave behind a description of the daughters' pact, but it left something even more powerful, the marks of what it tried to hide. And it is in these marks, in these silences, in these holes, in these erased gestures, that the dark secret returns to the surface, even after millennia buried by the very hands that created it. And when you look at the ruins today, you realize that some stories do not survive by force, but by the fear they cause even after they are erased. When you move away from the silent ruins that were once internal chambers of the palace, the light seems different, less alive, less warm, less present. It is as if Egypt itself, so proud of its stories engraved in stone, carries a weight that it cannot admit. The sand covers ancient walls, the wind erases traces before they can be read, and the sun illuminates objects that no one knows how to interpret anymore. And in the middle of this scenario that mixes grandeur and oblivion, a question grows like a shadow. How many lives were sacrificed so that a single throne could remain standing? The Pharaoh's daughters left no poems, no letters, no accounts. They left no tombs of their own, no statues, no inscriptions with their names. The history that should tell who they were was erased by trained, obedient, silent hands, hands that knew that certain truths could not survive the fall of a dynasty, and yet small fragments escaped. Forgotten lines, scraped inscriptions, interrupted drawings, gaps in places where there should be names. All this forms an imperfect mosaic, but sufficient to reveal an uncomfortable truth. Egypt was not sustained only by the strength of the pharaohs. It was sustained by the silence of the daughters. When you remember the young woman who entered the forbidden room at the opening of this video, you realize something that time has not been able to erase. The fear in her steps was not fear of the gods. It was fear of men, fear of the system, fear of a pact that she did not choose but from which she could not escape. And when the doors closed behind her, it was not just a ritual that began. It was the beginning of the erasure of a life. The palace that seemed eternal crumbled. The pharaohs who seemed divine were replaced. The dynasties that seemed unbreakable fragmented. But the silence of these women, that imposed silence, that forced silence, that silence that carried the weight of the crown, continued to echo long after their names were removed from the papyri. There is something deeply disturbing in realizing that the most important stories of antiquity were not written in stone, but buried under it. Stories that survived only because someone, at some distant moment, failed to destroy everything. Because a papyrus did not burn completely. Because a scribe crossed out the name too forcefully and left a mark that centuries later caught the attention of an archaeologist. Because a secret chamber was not completely sealed. Because silence, in trying to hide, accidentally revealed. And perhaps that is why these accounts touch us so much. Not for the mystery, not for the rituals, not for the politics, but for what remained in the subtext, for what could not be said, for what was torn away, for what should never have happened to young women who were born only with the mistake of carrying royal blood. When you look at the ruins, you realize that Egypt did not try only to destroy the pact. It tried to destroy the memories. It tried to erase the daughters. It tried to rewrite its own history so that no one would discover what an entire dynasty hid inside a room where not even the light dared to enter. But some shadows are more resistant than stones, and some silences are so heavy that they refuse to die. The dark secret of the Pharaoh's daughters did not survive in the official records. It survived in the vestiges of the erasure. It survived in what was hidden too much. It survived in the gaps, in the fragments, in the scrapings, in the remains of braided linen, found where they should never be. And in the end, you understand. What makes this story so disturbing is not what they did. It's what was done to them. If you want to continue exploring forbidden stories that time has tried to bury, follow here. Some secrets, even after millennia, continue waiting for those who have the courage to listen to them.